Welcome to this operational explainer. We're diving straight into the Indian peacekeeping forces' incredibly complex transition from conventional warfare to counterinsurgency in Sri Lanka. It's a fascinating, stark lesson in what actually happens when a traditional battlefield literally disappears overnight. So let's kick things off with a fundamental question, one that totally shatters the illusion of absolute victory. Why does war continue after victory? We so often look at the capture of a capital city as the finish line, right? But the reality of modern warfare is that taking ground is frequently just the opening act. Think about the fall of Jaffna, the primary urban center in this conflict. The LTTE didn't just surrender. Instead, they completely vanished. They slipped right out of the city and faded deep into the dense, incredibly unforgiving jungles of the Vanni region. And in a matter of days, they reorganized and launched a grueling rural insurgency. The conventional war? Well, that was over. But a vastly more complicated conflict had just begun. Our operational briefing today is broken down into 6 phases. We'll cover the illusion of victory, the two-front strategy, rebuilding the state, executing the campaign, winning hearts and minds, and finally, some core lessons. First up, the illusion of victory and the sudden shift in the battlefield. It is wild to see how this conflict completely re-anchored itself spatially, practically overnight. The IPKF was suddenly forced into this massive redeployment. They had to switch from an urban environment up in the north all the way down into the rural, heavily forested Vanni region. We're talking about a shift from holding city blocks to suddenly needing to project force across vast, vacant areas. And they had to do this to deny the insurgents any sort of permanent safe haven.
Part 2. The two-front strategy. How do you fight on multiple plans?
While the IPKF commanders quickly realized a hard truth, you just cannot win an insurgency with bullets alone. It required a very strict dual-front doctrine. On the one hand, you've got military pressure. These are relentless, kinetic operations designed purely to deny the enemy any rest and force them to the negotiating table. But at the exact same time, you have to secure a political solution. That means extending administrative control and actually restoring daily life so you can eventually hold democratic elections. One without the other, it absolutely fails. To really grasp the kind of enemy the IPKF was up against, we need to break down their system into 5 core pillars. First, people, embedding themselves deep within the local population. Then, terrain, utilizing those dense jungle sanctuaries. Information, actively monitoring military radio networks. Supply, receiving regular maritime shipments of arms. And finally, ideology, maintaining a really fierce political drive. Make no mistake, this was a highly capable, deeply systematic adversary. That brings us to part 3, rebuilding the state through civil affairs reconstruction. What's amazing here is that despite having virtually zero practical experience in civil administration on this massive scale, the Indian Army systematically brought Jaffna, which was a city of 1 million people, back to life. They were moving food right past active ambush zones to reach empty cooperatives. Army doctors were stepping in, literally supplying food to patients straight from military stocks. Engineers got the electricity running again. They reopened the schools, established a town commandant. They were quite literally rebuilding society from the ground up to deny the insurgents any sort of power vacuum. Number 4, executing the campaign and sealing the zones. So, to maintain that unrelenting pressure we talked about, the IPKF ballooned to a massive 80,000 personnel. They essentially carved the entire theater up into 4 distinct operational sectors: northern, central, eastern, and southern, with each one commanded by a separate division. Setting up this rigid grid was absolutely crucial. It allowed them to coordinate on a broad scale with civil districts, all while systematically tightening the operational noose right around the jungle. Operating from the flanks and moving inwards, the IPKF executed a frankly relentless timeline of major operations. Month after month, they were launching these massive search and destroy missions. You had Operation Blooming Tulip, which cleared out a sprawling 30-village base, and Operation Virat, where they were uncovering massive concrete bunkers and hidden generators. The whole strategy was incredibly methodical. Clear out areas step by step, forcefully drive the insurgents into the center, and systematically destroy their strongholds just in time for the elections. Now, if we zoom in from that macro timeline down to the micro tactics, we find a 5-step cycle that reveals the exact, incredibly grueling methodology they used on the ground. Because, it was almost impossible to identify fighters from civilians, so simply clearing an area, that wasn't enough. You had to keep it sterile. First, they had to find the enemy through intelligence, then fix them in place by installing metal roadblocks and tight cordons. Next, they had to isolate those jungle elements entirely from the civilian population. Then, neutralize the threat through direct action. And finally, stabilize that cleared zone with civil administration. It's a cyclical, completely exhaustive process.
Phase 5, winning hearts and minds, or the WHAM strategy. Okay, what's really fascinating to me about this phase is how the IPKF actively worked to reverse public alienation by strongly prioritizing the humane treatment of prisoners, like actually placing them in rehabilitation centers with vocational training instead of throwing them into harsh prisons. They built a really profound level of trust. They even set up grievance cells. Locals could go there to resolve disputes or, incredibly, even report military excesses. This humane approach genuinely flipped public alienation into public confidence. And guess what confidence yields? It yields critical, actionable intelligence. Locals actually began voluntarily sharing the locations of hidden weapons and explosives, which essentially crippled the insurgents from the inside out.
Now, impartially looking at the source data, it's clear that this tactical success was achieved despite some really severe geopolitical friction. The military was fighting against enormous odds here. The whole mission was deeply complicated by external financial assistance flowing right to the insurgents. Add to that cross-border safe havens, intercepted communications, and these constantly shifting political alliances at the highest levels of government. It was just a chaotic environment, meaning the military had to remain incredibly laser-focused on their immediate operational goals. And the ultimate tactical validation of all that focus? 60%. That was the voter turnout in the November 1988 elections. Think about that for a second. Despite massive calls for boycotts and really severe threats of violence from the insurgents, this dual-front strategy successfully secured the space well enough to allow 60% of the population to safely cast their ballots. It was a massive, massive logistical and security triumph.
Finally, Phase 6, the final lessons on winning stability.
We are looking at the timeless equation for counter-insurgency success here. First, you need military victory just to create the space. Then, you need political legitimacy to actually govern that space. And finally, you absolutely must have population support to sustain it. If you don't align these three pillars concurrently, long-term stability is basically impossible. Having one without the others, it's literally a house built on sand. This core doctrine, which is pulled directly from the operation's history, perfectly summarizes this exact reality. You see, military force during a counterinsurgency phase is rarely about utter annihilation. Instead, it's a highly calibrated tool designed specifically to compel a political resolution. You apply that unrelenting pressure day in and day out until the enemy finally accepts that fighting is no longer a viable path forward. All of this leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought. When we look at the landscape of modern warfare, is capturing a city ever truly the end of the fight? Or does true victory actually lie in the grueling, unglamorous, multi-front campaign to win the peace? Thanks for joining me on this explainer today. Until next time, keep questioning the consensus.